Simple is one of those words that can change in meaning depending how you use it. Quick little story for you. I remember a kid at school once told another kid they had a very simple brain. So, in response, that kid shoved the other kid onto the ground and was never called simple again. A simple solution, I suppose. When it comes to video games, and specifically older video games, I've seen them described as simple in both a positive and negative context. Generally, it comes as a positive when you're saying a game is simple as opposed to complicated. You never see a game praised for that. And it's used as an insult when you say a game is simple as opposed to having depth. But what if I were to say that a game can be simple but also have depth? The best of both worlds. Like looking at a painting. Seems simple enough at first, but look at it long enough and you can start to see the true beauty that you hadn't noticed before. A phrase that pops up a lot when it comes to retro games is easy to learn, hard to master. Ideally, a game is simple to learn how to start playing. The depth then comes in from getting closer to mastering it, through the process of learning all the different nuances required. Yeah, retro games certainly have a reputation for being difficult to master, so what's the issue? Well, if not everybody masters the game, or even attempts to head in that direction, they may not become aware of the depth. You know, the real meat and potatoes of the game. Easy to learn and even easier to dismiss as a simple game. Oops! Beat 'em ups are a perfect example of a misunderstood genre, but I see this happen to a lot. In a beat 'em up, you can kinda just drift around the screen while hammering away on buttons and sort of make progress, but you're still going to lose a lot of lives in the process. Many people come away thinking that they're dying simply because the game is cheap, like some sort of carnival game rigged to take your money. Some even go so far as to call them quarter munchers. But come on people, arcade cabinets don't have teeth. Ooh, turns out teeth don't really help much anyways. Of course, arcade games do need to provide some resistance. You wouldn't want a cakewalk, but when the amount of money generated by arcade games depends on you sucking at it, it's certainly enough to make a person suspicious. But while arcades may have had a certain target demographic in mind, you can get better at the games and start to learn all the ins and outs. It kind of reminds me of the From Software games. People call them cheap until they figure it out and then they love it because it feels like playing a totally different game. Remember, video games are created by talented developers who likely have a lot of passion for the medium. Coming up with the idea to have bouncy rings that barely fit over bottles was not a labor of love, I promise you. Circling back to beat 'em ups, you actually can avoid getting hit as much as you are, but you gotta start mastering concepts like spacing, crowd control, attack priority, hitboxes, enemy patterns, and how you can best utilize your moveset to take advantage of all of this. Suddenly you're playing an entirely different game as you see all the different factors that contribute to not getting hit so much and taking out enemies more efficiently. I'd argue that there's a difference between cheap and well-designed difficulty, although some people will just automatically label anything they can't get past as cheap. Some of my high school teachers were cheap. Well-designed difficulty gives you the tools you need to get through the obstacles and even makes it enjoyable to figure out how to utilize them. And yet, ironically, for a genre like beat 'em ups, ignoring all these concepts and going with the tried and true drift around the screen while hammering the attack button is the only way some people are willing to give these games a chance. Perhaps this is because they are simply not aware of the more advanced ways of approaching the game, and maybe they're having fun without all of that. Fun, that's right, let's not forget that plays a factor in all of this as well. Playing games and fun go hand in hand, at least for most people they do. And when it comes to having fun, sometimes simple is a good thing. Ever heard the expression, enjoy the simpler things in life? Simple is good, but too simple is bad. Heck, you can throw the word too onto just about anything and it becomes bad. Hence, the title of this video, why retro video games are not too simple. In fact, something I see all the time is people citing the simplicity of retro games as a reason for their appeal. And when it comes to both older games and more modern games, phrases like simple to learn or simple to play are often used as positives. The goal of any game designer, whether it was decades ago or the present day, is quite often to make a game appealing and easy to get into so that the player will want to keep playing. You don't want to make your game feel like a flight simulator, that is, unless your game is a flight simulator, in which case that's the point. But to further my point, I'll say that one of the marquees of good game design, whether retro or modern, is to have simplicity integrated into the game in the areas where it will benefit most. Utilizing the C-stick to easily rotate the screen around, genius game design. Okay, let's talk about controllers now. After all, controllers used to not have as many buttons, which many would say is more simple. In fact, I've heard stories about how some people won't play modern games because the amount of buttons, bumpers, and sticks is just too much. 2 analog sticks, sneaky buttons up on the top, what is going on here? But slap an old gamepad in front of them and hey, now we're talking. A D-pad, 4 buttons, and 2 of them you can more or less just ignore. Not a lot to keep track of. I will say though that controllers more or less hit their peak as far as number of buttons and analog sticks go in 1997 with the DualShock, and depending on what you consider to be retro, which some people consider all games from the 90s to be, having a simple controller isn't necessarily a feature of all retro games. Heck, some people still think the Nintendo 64 controller is more complicated than anything to come after it. In any case, I would argue it is the goal of any game designer to make their controls as intuitive and easy to understand as possible. Much like the goal of any controller design is to make a controller that is easy to use, regardless of how many buttons there are. So, having a controller with less buttons on it isn't necessarily too simple. You want to fight the game, not your controller. Nothing worse than having to discipline an unruly controller. I don't do this for kids, but for this rascal, well, it pushed one too many buttons. And now, let's talk about story. People often say that retro games don't have good stories. I don't think that's looking at it the right way though. I've always seen stories in video games as needing to serve a certain purpose depending on the game. And sometimes that purpose is staying out of the way, while still perhaps being charming enough. Let me tell you, nothing kills the party like an unwanted story. My GoldenEye constantly tells me the story of when it was the king of multiplayer first-person shooters, and I just try to politely listen through it. For certain types of games, all they need is a little bit of context to set the stage for what you're doing. And when what you're doing is jumping around and smashing your head into stuff, you really don't need much context. Now, when a game is making its story a focal part of the game, and therefore a focal part of the experience, then I think it's more important for the story to carry more weight and make a bigger impact on the player, regardless of when the game came out. It's all about the context. You wouldn't call a bedtime story for kids crap because it doesn't measure up to Charles Dickens, would ya? And believe me, my niece and nephew think I'm much more clever than Dickens. In any case, I think simplicity in a video game story is not an inherently bad thing and can even be a good thing depending what you're looking for and what the game is trying to do. Alright, now the next thing I want to go over is what I like to call the where the heck do I go, what the heck do I do games. Not that there's anything wrong with them, but it certainly makes things a lot more simple when you do know where to go in a game. Plus, even if you do know where the heck to go, you may still not know what the heck to do. In fact, I'd say not knowing what the heck to do should be a feeling very familiar to any gamer. You ever get to a boss or a certain section of a game and find yourself racking your brain to figure out how to get past it? It's not always so simple. I suppose my closing argument would be that very few video games are too simple, at least when it comes to the good ones. And of the ones that are, it's not necessarily dependent on how old of a game it is. The depth is there. Some games just bring this depth to the surface in ways that are more blatant than others. But with that said, for this video's question, I'd like to ask you what some of your favorite aspects in games are that are just the right amount of simple. And this could include both modern and retro games. So with that said, leave your answer down below and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's